you can disable your video and just listen or just contribute with your voice. That's totally welcome. Can everybody hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Great. Does everybody know how to use your mute and unmute function? Looks like most people have got the mute. Yeah, and if you need to find the unmute, you can just go down to the corner left of your box there, and there's a button with a little microphone on it, and it says mute my audio, and you can unmute it from there as well. So yeah, I'm going to start recording now. Actually, John, if you could start recording it from yours, since you're
it should show on your screen that I'm recording. I just started.
Okay, great, perfect. Okay, so yeah, thank you everyone for joining. This is our second virtual salon here at the BirdHouse, and we thought it went really well the first time, and trying to adjust to our lives of not being able to gather in big groups. So we're honored to have Lazaro Arvizu Jr. here with us today, and for this salon conversation we're calling Renegotiating Our Relationships to Land and Community, and looking at things through the lens of the colonial legacy here in Southern California, and also of the living traditions of the living people who are the Tongva, the Acjachemen, the Chumash, the other traditional peoples of Southern California. So, so with that, I'm going to start by giving a land acknowledgement to the Tongva people and to Tovangar, the land that we're on. Pronunciation is going to be very challenging here, but bear with me. We, the Tara Chotam, the indigenous people, the traditional landowners of Tovangar, the Los Angeles Basin, and the Channel Islands, are direct descendants of the beings, Amu Pavatem, the first people who formed our lands during creation time. We have always been here. They prepared the landscape world, Tovangar, for the coming of humans with Nahu and Nax, natural law, order, and knowledge, and Maksaks, gifts, which are food, clothing, shelter, medicine, archetypes in the landscape. From our Hanukvatem ancestors, we were imbued the responsibility and obligation, guided by protocol and etiquette, to be a part of, take care of, and ensure the welfare of the family, our extended family, defined in its most inclusive expression, that is, human, animal, plant, spirit, ancestor, and landscape, the nature, and to pass these teachings and responsibilities onto our children and grandchildren, and all who now inhabit this place. Great. So, yeah, thank you, Lazaro, for joining us here on Tovangar. And I'd like to pass it to you for a minute if you'd like to say a few words about how you're approaching this conversation and how we're gathering here today.
Sure, thank you, and greetings to everybody. Hello out there. It's nice to see the virtual you, and I hope to meet those I haven't met sometime in the future in person. And with great recognition for the keepers of the land and my community. And I wanted to make a comment, put it out there that myself and Cameron had been looking at some literature to go along with this discussion, and I wasn't sure if we were going to include it, if anybody has read these, or if we were going to make these available. One of them is Renegotiating. I'm sorry. It's the parallels between the colonization of land and peoples, and that was by this gentleman who used to work for the Akwesasne notes, which is a prominent newspaper of Native American origin. I think they started it in the 70s or something like that. And his name is John Mohawk. So I wasn't sure if we were going to include that, Cam.
Yeah, I'm going to make various resources available to people in the follow-up to this. Some
Okay.
of the things that we'll be touching on here, there's a couple of articles. Yeah, that one, How the Conquest of Indigenous People Parallels the Conquest of Nature, by John Mohawk. And another really prominent one that we'll reference a lot it's called Our Sacred Waters, Theorizing Kuuyam as a Decolonial Possibility by Charles Sepulveda. And that one's really, that's one that Lazaro shared with me and with us here at the BirdHouse as a way to consider how we're approaching our relationship of working together. And it focuses on our lands here on Tongva.
Yeah, and the last one we were talking about was called Rethinking the Apocalypse, an Indigenous Anti-Futurist Manifesto. And that's something I think we might, well, the reason I was commenting is because this is all relative, and actually these articles, these writings are some way or another also interrelated, and they definitely would shed some light or frame this discussion in a way that's quite meaningful. So I had a chance to look over them. I wasn't real familiar of every detail. I mean, there's a lot here, but there were a couple of points I wanted to discuss with everybody here, and I wanted to start as I guess with as a starting place with the title, what we're talking about here. What does it mean to renegotiate our relationships to land and community? And within that, I'd like to comment that how we use the word community for us should involve not just humans, not just the human people. We should acknowledge, or at least in the indigenous thought, the other relatives include, our community include animals and plants and even rocks and even the smallest creatures, the smallest things that exist on the land. And so that's one of the things that I wanted to talk to you more about, and also listen to what you have to say about that. But the other thing is that we've been having this discussion in my community about how rocks, plants, animals have their own communities independent of us. That's called nature, right? That's what's happening in nature, is that rocks, plants, and animals have their own communities that they rely on each other, they interact. And so that's something interesting I think we could discuss.
Great. Thank you, Lazaro. Yeah, so I'm going to give kind of a prompt that's based out of some of the writing that's in the Our Sacred Waters article. And then, I hope that this will be run as a real conversation, as a dialogue between everyone who's here. Feel free to speak. This is an opportunity for us to. We're not here to simply answer questions in a final way. We're here to try to deepen inquiry. We're here to try to help each other through our various perspectives see things in a different way and see possibilities we might not have seen before. I think often an interesting way to look at the present is to consider how we got here, and so a bit of history. Charles Sepulveda, in the Our Sacred Waters article, he talks about how the Spanish process of colonization here in Southern California really involved what he calls a colonial logic of domestication and submission. And he points to two particular examples, of one of which is the encasing of the Santa Ana River and also the LA River in concrete. He calls it the entombing and the imprisoning of the river. And the other piece is it was an institution, colonial institution of the Spanish church called the monjerio, which was basically functioned as a women's prison. And he draws a really strong parallel between this gendered aspect of domestication, between how we've tried to control specifically water, land and water, and then also around women as well. So we have to acknowledge, that we have, and we've attempted to imprison this naturally flowing cycle of the water. And that there's a significant difference between that approach and what the indigenous people held here. So Sepulveda says, in the Tongva language, we should be able to call our lands Ayupavin, our place where water flows. But currently we cannot apply this word to the Santa Ana River. So the contrast between our approach of encasing it in concrete is that, he writes, the Santa Ana River was expected to seasonally flood, providing water for marshes and wetlands, producing plant materials such as tulle, used for many purposes, including house and boat construction. And I think there's something really interesting there about there's this willingness that's displayed in that to move with the land, to respond to cycles in the land, and not to try to, from the outset, fix something literally in concrete, and to try to keep it from changing. The change is part of what's expected there. And so I'm just offering that up as a prompt, and if anybody wants to respond to that, or how they relate to nature, or their own thinking and their processes of interacting with themselves or in nature, if there's anything that comes up for you, I'd be interested to hear that. Yeah, Bella.
What it brings up for me with the exact example of the river is that notion of fertility of the edge, that edge that is changing and that we need. And when we are reducing it to just have the flow that we can expect on, and all that, we are missing everything that is growing out of this edge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that seasonality of that changing changing water level, obviously, but the way that the ecology moves, it's in this dynamic flow process. Yeah, I think there's something that's interesting to me as well, that is the cyclical nature of it. So you're regarding it as, this is an appropriate flow. This is the appropriate expression of this landscape. Like Lazaro was encouraging us to think about community as acknowledging, the relatives of plants and animals, but also of these cycles, that these cycles are part of this place, and part of the place is this this swelling of the river seasonally. But what that yields are these necessary materials for life. So we're not looking at that as a problem, not looking at that as something that needs to be contained, but it's something that gives rise to this materials that are necessary for the continuation of life.
I want to chime in if that's okay.
Yeah, please.
There's two stories I have. They're short, and they have directly to do with this situation with people changing the landscape to suit themselves instead of changing their own behavior and adapting to conserve the landscape to some extent. And those are very different attitudes. So in the history of California, the first mission, second mission they built was the San Gabriel mission in Alta, California. The first one was San Diego. And initially they built it over here where I live by the Rio Hondo. And about a year and a half into it being completed, mind you, it's made out of adobe, there was a great flood, because the seasonal floods, every about 7 years, there's a really big rain, and it'll just flood. So the mission they had built washed away. It was destroyed because the missionaries and the soldiers didn't know the landscape. They didn't know the patterns of this specific landscape. They had a disregard for it. So what happened was they had to rebuild the mission at its current site up San Gabriel Road, higher ground. That's what they did. So it's interesting because the San Gabriel, the road called San Gabriel starts right there where the initial mission was, and it leads up to the current mission. It's called San Gabriel Boulevard, I believe. So that's an interesting story. The other story, fast forward up to about 5 years ago, the city of Santa Ana was gonna put some money into making the riverway there, the Santa Ana River that passes through downtown Santa Ana, that part, which they're gentrifying. They're building a lot there, condominiums, offices, stuff like that. And they did an inquiry. They were asking people to find out. They wanted to know what the public wanted along the riverway. And people sent responses such as, oh, we would like a jogging trail. We want a dog park. We want a playground. We want, none of the responses had anything to do with reciprocating back to the river. It was a one-way operation where the people have the habit and the ideal that the river is there for their accommodation, their use, their manipulation of it, right? In order to accomplish or to continue their lifestyle. So that tells us a bit about how disconnected we are from the river. I'm just talking about rivers, but in general, plants and animals in general. We're disconnected from them in such a way that we don't sometimes empathize, you know, and we're just sort of, you know, each person living in our bubble without that deeper conscious of the community, right? That we're all related and we together form a community, or we should. So those are my two stories about rivers in LA. It's kind of, it made me think, you know, learning these stories, reading about them, it really made me think, wow, you know, it's all about attitudes, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Greg, did you have a comment? And then John?
Yes, thank you. Mike Davis in Ecology of Fear actually cites a study done in the early 20th century for the LA River, where they were going to acknowledge the river's life, we might say, and the flooding, and they were going to protect the floodplains and even make a green belt, especially in Atwater Village, that area. And of course, it was overwhelmed by business interests and didn't happen. So we do know these things, and we even, it's like Chavez Ravine, there were people who opposed that removal of people living there for Dodger Stadium. And one guy in particular, I forget his name, but he was really strongly against it and for the people living there. And he was, again, overwhelmed by business interests and was called a communist. And, you know, this was not a good time to be called a communist when that was being built. And it reminds me of Vine Deloria Jr.'s God is Red, where he talks about Western mythology and ideology being driven by concerns with time, whether it's you know, the Christian new heaven and new earth, or even the Enlightenment idea of progress through science. And he says, you know, what becomes disposable in a mythology and ideology of time is space. And in fact, he says time consumes space. And that's, I think, what we're seeing here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Greg. And that's great because I want to bring up the conceptions of time here in a bit. John, go ahead.
Yeah, the story that Lazaro told, I remember him telling that once before, and the version that he told was that, of course, the people who built that mission were the enslaved indigenous people. And what they didn't tell them, knowing the seasons and the ways of the land there, was that this was being built on floodlands and that it would be taken away. So in some ways they had a moment of glory to see it wash away, and that it really highlighted the obvious relationship parallel between the way the colonialists, the white folks who came here, treat the land in direct parallel with the way they treat the people, like to be bent to their will, to encase and enslave. And it's, I think, at the heart of what we're talking about here is the parallels between the way we treat what we call nature and each other, or let's say the others. And that's the legacy I live in. That's the legacy that Los Angeles is built on, and I'd say America. Yeah, there's lots to say about all of that, but that's a kind of the vector starting point that I'm working from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. I mean, that connects to another point. So that second example that Sepulveda really develops in the article is the discussion of this institution called the Monjerio, which, like I said, was an all-female prison that was run by the Spanish church there. And he says this about it, and this is a line that really it was just sort of like a punch in the gut. He says, although people had been living in California for over 10,000 years, for time immemorial, the Monjerio was the first prison, a racial and gendered institution targeting indigenous women through a logic of domestication and submission. And the parallel, I think, is quite obvious between the way that the river is encased in concrete, and then the encasing and entombing of bodies, of women's bodies in that institution. But just that idea that we're at a moment where we're thinking a lot about policing and the carceral state here in the US, and to just acknowledge the history that the people groups had been able to live for millennia without having an institution like prison. It speaks to the possibility of a kind of relationship that people can be in, where that desire to dominate is not the dominant mode, for lack of a better phrase. But yeah, just the idea that prisons have not always been such an institution, that there are other ways of relating to each other culturally and socially that don't require that as the kind of punishment, as the response to anything.
I wanted to add a bit, but I don't know if there's somebody else.
I did want to add one thing. So I don't know how much in depth you got into with Sam, but I wondered if he would talk about his father's relationship with the Northern Cheyenne and their Supreme Court bid, because it's a very interesting connection, and it's why that we are connected with them now. So would you mind sharing that, Sam?
I'd be happy to share. And I'll just frame it by saying, I think that what is hard for people who don't have any understanding through indigenous wisdom, connection to land, is that people on the land, as Lazaro said, I'm not indigenous, but I've come to know the Northern Cheyenne my entire life and learn about their wisdom. It's so interconnected, and us white folk who come from a Western tradition almost have to have a re-education to what that means, to have an appreciation of that. So I just want to frame it with that. My father was attorney for the Northern Cheyenne for nearly 40 years. He's no longer with us, my dad, but in the 1970s, he helped take a course a court case to the Supreme Court to protect the Northern Cheyenne's coal interests, which were being bought up individual folks who didn't know much better. And the Powder River Basin, which is still one of the most pristine coal reserves in the country, was protected through that legal battle that the Northern Cheyenne won with my father in the 1970s. And that started a long relationship of my father, myself, and now students, and as I bring to the reservation, to understand an anti-colonial, anti-Western ethic, which is the land is more important and brings more than the resources from which we use it for. And the amazing story about this coal reserve is that the Cheyenne live in serious poverty. You know, they've stayed very traditional. They've stayed very disconnected from white people because they've had a terrible history with them, and some of that continues. But in my lifetime, we now see that the wisdom of not mining that coal is actually much wiser wisdom than having taken a quick economic benefit. It would have been short-lived for the Cheyenne, even though it would have been many millions of dollars, but that would have ruined their reservation. And so it's an example of how our Western colonial thought, which we think is about, you know, that making money from resources makes all the sense in the world. Well, today it makes no sense to mine that coal, but in the 70s, they had to fight, and they used their traditional beliefs and their experience and connection to the land to understand that that was more important than economic gain. So, you know, this is a really interesting conversation to me, and certainly connected to my work, and I'm very interested to hear more.
Great, thank you, Sam. Someone else had a comment before Sam spoke. Is there someone wanting to add something? Cece?
I think Roxanne was raising her hand.
Roxanne too. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I guess just a comment around this idea of our attitudes really informing everything about what we think and how we act and what we do, and that, you know, it's hard for me to speak actually at this moment. I almost feel like I have a lump in my throat because there are so many layers of kind of, as you've touched on, Cameron, this attitudes of and actions of subjugation and pain and dominance and ownership, really, that it's our work to really actively be on, as Bella referred to, the living edge, and choose to come from a place that's not in the attitude of ownership. I feel like even in our personal relationships, even the way that we think about loving another human sometimes comes from a place of wanting them to be our one, our only. And when we acknowledge that there actually is no other, and that these other ecologies are a mirror of our inner ecology, these communities, then we can begin to like unpack and act from a more inclusive place. That's what it brings up for me.
Great, thank you. Cece, did you have something you wanted to speak to?
Yes,
Great, thank you.
Cameron. Hi, everyone. I wanted to acknowledge our water and where most of it comes from. A lot of our drinking water in LA comes from the Owens River Gorge. I think it's like 40%, I'm not quite sure. But if you look at the amount, so we've channelized our rivers and cemented over everything. And so when the rain comes down, it all goes into the channelized rivers and straight out into the ocean. And the amount that flows out into the ocean every year is nearly equivalent to the amount that we're stealing from the Owens River Valley. And so if we were able to get out of our scarcity mindset and recognize the abundance that we have on our land and accept that the land provides what we need, we could totally satisfy our needs for water in LA, being in LA without stealing water from elsewhere. So I think that in our attempts to control the land, we miss what we already have, what we're living on, what's in the land, and the resources that are around us. We're totally rich, and we don't need to steal those riches. So that's what comes up for me.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, I think that there is a, yeah, that speaks to, I think, a disconnection that a lot of people experience really profoundly between the actual materials and the processes that support their life from the sources and from the cycles. You know, there's an invisibility. I think the fact that we're able to simply to buy everything that we need, and that our paradigm of meeting our needs is through a marketplace, that I think that, yeah, there's this retraining, we need to develop this kind of muscle memory around seeing and interacting with the landscape in a way that will put us in a position where we can kind of acknowledge that these cycles are happening, and that there are ways of interacting in a landscape where it's both meeting human needs and it's having a positive impact in the environment. And I think this is a good time I just want to introduce the core concept of this article we keep referring to. And it's this notion of Kuuyam. And Kuuyam is the Tongva word for guests. So I'll just read this bit from Sepulveda here. He says that Kuuyam allows for a recentering of place, and instead of dividing peoples into categories and binaries, let's say the dialectic of native and settler, it allows all people to understand themselves as guests of the land. Either they behave appropriately or they do not. Either they act in ways that are respectful to the earth or they do not. This respect for the earth includes native peoples ourselves. We also must recognize the sacredness of our land, including our genealogical responsibilities. We must not be complicit, but instead seek awareness of the ways in which we have been colonized. Once we are aware, then we can begin the long process of decolonization. So we've framed this initially talking about kind of the problematic colonial view and the kind of mindset that brings and the behavior that informs. But I think this idea of guests, being guests on the land, if we consider the kind of responsibility that's entailed in that, I think we can start to develop like a bit of we just need to try to change the ways that we're seeing things and seeing ourselves in relation to land and landscape here. I'll open it up if anybody would like to make a comment about that or anything else.
I wanted to continue by relating something that's from the first article, or the second one you sent me, I'm sorry, called The Conquest of Indigenous Peoples Parallels the Conquest of Nature. And in it, the author is writing about the writings of a lawyer on one of the islands in the Caribbean, and he had to explain why it was okay basically to exploit the plants and animals on the islands there, and one of the points that he makes is that their culture is superior, so they have this mindset that they were more important than the plants and animals and even the people on the island. And I think that this is something that is kind of widely practiced, you know, our authority, our dominance over plants and animals and that sort of thing. And it gives us the I guess, the right to domesticate, right? And that I think goes back. I've looked at it over the years to European feudalism, right? The idea that few people would own the land and the other people would work it. They would grow one or two crops and make the money they needed to make, right? To continue this, and it was a cycle, right, of exploiting the land. And so that's something that the Spanish and other Europeans transplanted here to the New World and superimposed it on every single landscape, right, that they had populated. And so this very much is what happened to the LA River, to the Santa Ana River, in that instead of working with the produce that the river could provide, right, they practiced and tried to keep their own culture with the idea that their culture was superior to that of the people that have been living here for a long time, you know? So ideally, touching again on Sepulveda, and I'm talking about the Sepulveda that Cameron's. It's kind of confusing because this other guy too is also, his last name is Sepulveda, but he lived in the 1500s. So his name was Juan Gines de Sepulveda. And sorry, I just wanted to clear that up. I didn't mean to jump around, but you know, some of the things that we could use for our lives are actually being wasted, including the water, right? It's being washed away. It could provide building materials to provide housing. There's a lot of different medicinal, not to mention food plants that we could be harvesting, that the landscape naturally produces, right? So these are kind of new ideas, and being that, you know, we're a colonized people, right? We've been taught this lifestyle, this attitude, and this behavior, and you know, so this calls for, you know, once we understand it, a renegotiation. So for us, and you know, all of us are living different lives, right? I mean, everybody has a different challenge, different situation. So what I was thinking was that the relationship, the renegotiating has to do with us beginning on an individual basis, processing this idea, this practice, and making it relevant to our life, our lifestyle, and our situation. And you know, I think that what I wrote here was that it's going to take time. You know, the colonization is a process. It's still going on, actually. It's not something that happened in the 16, 17, and 1800s. It's still happening, right? So the word decolonization is starting to be thrown around, right? For the last, I think, probably 10 years or so, it's becoming a little bit more of a word that people are using. And the question, you know, not to go off into that direction without acknowledging the core of what we're talking about here, but what does it mean to decolonize, right? And does that mean stop using plants in a certain way? You know, there's a certain choice and work that has to be done in our personal lives. I think, you know, that way it starts to make sense for us, and we could put it into practice.
Great. Thank you. Greg, and then Angela.
Yeah, thank you. Just wanted to say at PRS, the Philosophical Research Society, we've been talking about decolonization as telling a different story to ourselves and to each other. And our experience is in the West is that we don't do that willingly. We do it only when the universe forces us to, and it's now doing that. Now's the time.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Angela?
Do you need me?
You're on mute.
Oh,
Can
okay.
you?
I'm unmuted on my thing.
Oh, sorry. Angela Miller was trying to.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
To thank you for introducing me to the work of Stephen Jenkinson. Part of what I'm despairing about right now is what I call the recently woke white folk. If we don't have some path for them to become functioning elders so that they transmit this new, like the empathetic momentum that's happening, it won't pass between the generations like it's supposed to. So part of my despair is to educate, do my personal work, but also to educate people my age that this is their raison d'etre. This is why they're alive. And if they don't understand that they need to stand in that gap and pass this information to the next generation, that's a real problem. So I don't really know how to do that. I haven't succeeded yet. But one of the initiatives Sam and I are also involved in is an elder listening circle that we have collaborated with what's called the Exchange House in Akron that works with refugees. So they started a pop-up restaurant so that these burgeoning entrepreneurs can make their food. And so we're collaborating so that the elders can come and eat the food and learn about their tradition at the same time. But there needs to be a whole lot more of that, just educating people my age that this is what they need to be doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so much about the intergenerational piece. So I guess it's appropriate now that you and I are having this moment, Mom, of both acknowledging that in the course of this conversation. I think that, yeah, the kind of the changes that can happen within a culture in a generation, or the small sort of generational increments that we have nowadays, they can just be a flash in the pan unless it's really consolidated. And I'm thinking, you know, I want to introduce this concept of ritual into the space here. I think when I was speaking about the anticipation, the expectation that the Santa Ana River would flood on a seasonal basis, and the flooding would produce useful plants for materials for the life. It made me think about like ritual as a cycle, like that rituals can be an act that it marks a cycle. It's another way of marking time, to bring this concept of time into it. The time's happening seasonally, and that a ritual is a thing that can it can be like moving with the land as the land and the water moves, and it's both practical and it's sacred, right? And that those two are not really regarded as distinct. That meeting one's needs, that a life way where one's needs are met through this ritualistic way, and if that is done on a communal or a village scale, that transmission is happening in an active way that's responding to the seasonal cycle, that's responding to the passage of time in this other way. And it's not, it's not a distinct thing of like, we get our resources here, we have our sacred, you know, church over here, we have our sacredness over here, that it's all gathered there on the land, right? That one's life way is rooted in the land and the community, and the passing of wisdom and the development of tradition is all happening through a single act. Like it's meeting all of these different needs. And you know, there's a part of me that that I think is really yearning for that. And I think that, yeah, we're all here sort of asking a question about how we can interact in ways that feel more holistically integrated in those sorts of things, of us being together in community, being together on the land. So Lazaro, I don't know if you'd like to say anything about ritual, or the role of ritual and ceremony, and how that that's tied to the land and community for the Tongva.
Yeah, sure. So we have different practices that allow us to exist here. It's not really, I wouldn't say taking, but for example, we have protocols when we use a material like a plant material. It's not just to go out there and hack it down, right? For beauty. There has to be a purpose behind why we would be cutting it, right? For example, um, uh, reeds like tule reeds or willow or something like that. And then we try to practice reciprocity, of course, in some way, give back, right? That's a really important notion, I think, in that that's the only way for it to become a cycle that involves a good relationship, a healthy relationship, right? So something that Cam talked about is our needs, right? Our needs are basic needs as humans, right? And the basic needs of all creatures, actually, right? Not just human beings, and those are food, water, air, clothing, and housing. Those are the basic ones, right? And so, what we could take from as a lesson from humanity here in the Los Angeles Basin over many thousands of years and generations is their adaptation. The adaptation, instead of adapting the land to accommodate yourself, right? You adapt to the land a little better, right? I mean, that's how they learned over generations, you know, which plant to eat at what time of the year, right? What each plant properties were, what the qualities were, and where to find it, right? And how to ritually harvest it. That was really important. It's really important to know how to ritually harvest because there's it's funny we have this saying in my community of plant people. We say the plant knows, right? The plant knows, you know, it has its own intelligence. And so before we're gonna cut or do something, we do a ritual. It might be an offering, that sort of thing. It might be a prayer. It might be us talking to the plant. It might be, and these seem like things that are out there, right? For people, you know, today. My neighbors probably think that, well, my neighbors think that I have a bunch of weeds in my front yard, but actually they're medicinal plants, you know. And you know, it's taken me a long time to sort of retrain them to stop looking at the lawn as the model of what somebody's front yard should look like, right? You know, not to mention I live on a floodplain, and you know, there's a water, right? We need to conserve water. There's a lot of things, right? So what we do is we also have a ritual that we celebrate the equinox, and that has to do with also, I believe, something Cam talked briefly about was time, our conception of time, right? And how we use time. So of course, people, all ancient people, a long time ago, you know, didn't have a calendar. You know, they were, I guess, their sense of time was broader and based on the amount of daylight, and there are other elements, right? Other ways of telling what time of the year it was, or whatever they were happened to be thinking about. But these equinox ceremonies function to bring the people together at a certain location, and what they would do is they would erect. We still do it. We erect a pole. It's a post, and it has a name in our language. It's actually a part of our community, and that post has to be put in the center. And at a certain time of the day, right, the shadow is cast on a certain rock that they put. The rock has to be put in the right place. And I don't know if any of you know, but all around Southern California, there's a couple of caves. One of them is near Vasquez Rocks, and it's a cave or a rock system that at a certain time of the year, right, during the equinox, the light shines through there. So these are very important places. These are ritualistic spots that our people would stop over on, on their journey from one place to another, because part of the annual ritual too, I gotta say, was moving from one place to another to follow the cycle of the plants and animals, and to not exploit one area for too long. You have to leave for a while and give it a chance to repopulate, to come back, to not be treaded on, to be reseeded, and let the animals be in peace too. So this is a part of our cycle, and then the whole thing is like, okay, if you've been living off the coast for 3-4 months, right, and in times before calendars and internet and what's it called? What do they call it? Digital time. How do you know when to leave, when to go? Oh, well, your ritual is you watch the moon, you watch the cycles of the moon, you watch what plant is starting to grow and which one is not, and these are the I believe the smaller rituals that not just my people, all people around the world used to follow these practices.
Yeah, thank you. One thing I want to say on that, Lazaro, and then John. I was just reading recently about the function of, I think it was some ancient sites in Ireland or some of the henges in England, where, just as you're saying, on the equinox, the sun would enter an underground, it would enter a cave, would enter a rock formation. And the way that was held culturally was that the sun is associated with a masculine presence and the earth associated with a female presence. And that on the equinox, when the sun enters the earth in that way, the earth is impregnated. And then the spring bursts forth with all that life. So, I just want to put this frame here that, like, all of us who come from, all of us who are not indigenous people to the areas where we're living, we all were indigenous people somewhere recently. And I think the interval between when we stopped being indigenous and started to move along this colonial spectrum, the distance between that time and where we are now, I mean, that's just a blip of time, really, when you consider the whole span of human existence and where we and our various cultures were present on different landscapes as indigenous people. So I think that it's maybe not that far away from us, that capacity to be present with that indigenous thinking, but it requires some kind of slowing down, some kind of a way of seeing differently, of marking time differently. So I'm grateful that we're talking about this now. John, you had a comment.
Yeah, thank you. There's been so many awakening conversations here on the cycles and time. I think it was Lame Deer who said, before the white man, we had no history. Since the white man, we have only history. And there's this thing that I contemplated that for a while, and what he was talking about is there's no history in cycles. There's only cycle upon cycle within cycles, and that we've been robbed of that. And when I started paying attention to the moon cycles in my gardening, it really changed something in me to just belong to some other cycle than the one that's given to us by, or all of the ones given to us by our cultures. But I think in some ways, we're grappling with the question is, behind all of this conversation is now what? And I really wanted to acknowledge Roxanne, who evoked a kind of grief, a kind of pain that I feel, and that it's always right there for me when I have this conversation, or when I feel for the things that are going on in the wake of Black Lives Matter, or what preceded and is still going on. These kinds of things are just so painful to pretend like they're normal and that we live with them. And so at the heart of this is kind of like, now what? And one of the things that I hear when I hear ritual is a kind of sanctifying moment where we say, this is different now. It's a kind of evocation of whatever we can bring to sanctifying this moment or this moment forward. And that's one of the things that I think has been forgotten or has been watered down into our typical rituals. And that I've started to use to demark time, and something that I've woken up to. I acknowledge it with a moment, whatever I have on hand, with music or fire or, you know, just some way of sanctifying the moment. And that makes me feel good, because yes, this stuff will take generations, but declaring what little pieces we have to pass on to our children or to spread amongst ourselves is, I think, what we're talking about, what we have access to. And just one more thing about that is that I think the access point is the grief, is really acknowledging what we have lost and what we are now sort of becoming aware of and witnessing, waking up to how much this colonial mindset has this attitude that we've inherited, that we've never questioned basically until now, has given us in the way of the world, in the way of the genocide, in the way of the deforestation, etc. I mean, you name it, and that attitude has justified it. So one of the rituals that I'm performing in my life is every time I see that in myself, declaring an alternative way of being or thinking. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Sam?
Yeah, just Cameron, something you were saying, and John, connecting back to Lazaro. I mean, something that I experience when I bring people who've never been amongst an indigenous community living in greater harmony with the earth than most of us are, is that I think, as Cameron said, our connection to the earth and our indigenous context is not that far away. And when people experience that, and you can't learn it intellectually, I think you actually have to experience it. There is often an awakening in them that is unique for each person, that could be connected to their own personal life history. It could be connected to the earth, but it's a different way of seeing themselves and their relationship to the world and that idea of community. And I don't really know how to describe it except to say that it is transformational for a 14-year-old kid or a 50-year-old adult if given the opportunity. And I think it's only through sort of authentic ritual and tradition and connection to earth, some of the things Lazaro is talking about, not just seeing that Lazaro has a garden with medicinal plants, but actually being amongst people who really practice that tradition can bring about, I would call it an awakening for people and a reconnection to something many of us have lost.
Yeah, I want to, yeah, Bella, go ahead, and then I'll say something. Go ahead.
What is important is that these rituals are also transmitted and explained so that they actually really correspond to a function and not like a something that we just repeat. You know, we went to this friend's house in Maine, and you know, they had that certain way of putting the turkey in the oven, and they were always taking the one wing out, you know, and they couldn't remember why they were doing that, but the grandmother had been doing that, etc. And then we actually found out that the stove was too small and that they had repeated the tradition. So it's just a funny thing, but we need to really make sure that we're owning the tradition also and not just repeating them. And something out of what Lazaro was talking about earlier, which was saying that they had those indigenous local people built that building out of cob, and eventually 7 years later, when the floods came, the mud of the house just melted and the house disappeared. And the colonial people who were arriving there were, of course, in the position thinking that their thinking was superior, and never really even wanted to find out what would the local people would have done. And the local people chose not to share it because they had not even been asked to be at the table to talk about it. So one of the things that I'm becoming aware of with everything that is going on nowadays, and everything that we are now in the position of rethinking, is how important it is to just point into my own self, in that superiority that that somehow I have, and that I'm fooling myself about until I learned from other people who can just like guide me. And so I really realize all the learning there is to be done.
Great, thank you, Bella. I was thinking about this concept of time, and I like how it's getting peppered into various places in the conversation. And it made me think about, so just thinking about how in modern English we have a lot of our associations and the words we use around time, they're associated with money. And they're associated with, maybe there's a case that is historically associated with wage work. But let's just rattle a few off: that we spend time, that we save time, we waste time, we anticipate free time, right? So we have these associations where, time is associated with money. So obviously the phrase time is money, but we've gotten the opportunity, thanks to Lazaro, to participate in these little study groups with him. And we've worked on a few small traditional crafts. Lazaro, in addition to being a great musician and cultural educator, he also teaches a lot of different crafts, traditional Tongva crafts. And we got to work with some string, some cordage that was made from yucca. And in order to do that, you have to pound it out. You have to take rocks and you have to pound the green, fresh vegetable material away from the fibers of that. And so he and Jessica and I and one other gentleman who's there that day, a friend of Lazaro's, we were under a walnut tree, a native walnut tree, doing that task. And while you're doing that, there's this wrapping of the stone against a piece of wood or whatever you're working on as you're removing that material. And I noticed that my experience of time was largely absent. My thought of, is too much time passing? Do I need to go? What time is it? I wasn't really thinking about that. And I noticed that how that kind of that craft, that way of being engaged with my hands, but also paying attention to him and trying to figure out what he's doing and seeing how what he's doing is different than what I'm doing and trying to learn in that way. So that knowledge transfer, right? That was on the landscape, using materials from that landscape, that while we were there, yeah, that feeling of this kind of colonial imposition of time as ticking away, that you're always trying to beat the clock. There's a deadline coming, right? That all these associations, the heaviness around time felt pretty much absent. And that also, I could feel something about that rhythmic tapping. And I could start to see like, I could see how music would arise out of this. And then that music, the memory of that music, of that rhythm, would be bound to that activity that was done amongst the people. that would be remembered as having taken place on this piece of land, using this materials at a certain point in the year, a certain cycle of the year. And so it was just like this beautiful little whisper of like, this is possible. Like, try to pursue this in some way. And yeah, Lazaro or anybody else, if you want to speak to that. But I'm just interested in this idea of time and our association with it as this very quantitative thing, and how we can enter into different experiences of that through different activities and ways of being with each other.
Yeah. Hope I'm not jumping in front of anybody else. But I wanted to add to that the idea of memory. And something that took me years to learn was that the landscape has a memory. You know, the fact that the river would flood and flow a certain way tells us that the landscape has a memory. So when we're tapping, when we're playing music and dancing, for Native people, that's a very important aspect of our culture. Doesn't matter if not just my tribe, but other tribes would probably agree, right? They would say, yeah, that's. And part of the reason is that it's like knocking on the door of nature, you know. You're talking you're talking the language of the natural world, you know. So that's really important to acknowledge that there's a memory in the landscape, you know, that and for me that memory tells me that, or gives me faith that we could change things, that we could divert ourselves from the path we're on of destroying it, right? That's kind of what I thought. And I remember that there's a cliche, and they teach it to us in school. It's called sitting Indian style, right? That's what they say, right? And what is that to us? It's sitting on the floor cross-legged, right? Basically that's what it is, right? And there's another reason that, you know, us traditionally, we didn't have tables, so everything we did was sitting on the floor. You know, all the tools were spread out on the floor. So you become, you know, sort of I don't know if there's, if I have the appropriate words to describe the mode that it puts your mind in, but definitely, you know, it's very easy to lose track of time, and our, or at least our conception of time. Like something you made me think about was how people today have to take self-care time, right? They need me time and so on. They have all these other words, right? Me time and downtime. And so I'm just adding on, playing off what you were saying, right?
Yeah.
And the reason is because of the pressures of our culture, right? Cause us to sacrifice sometimes our well-being and our sense of self and all these things, you know, because of the pressure of time, you know. And you know, the 40-hour work week, or you know, the 7-day week, or whatever it is. And something that I think some of us have studied philosophy, and maybe we'll get to do some of the readings after this session, but it has to do with our conception of life too, time, right? How we spend our time, like you were saying, spend. But really, life is for us to live. It's not work to live. That kind of doesn't make sense, you know. In fact, in our culture, I don't even think we have a word for work. Like there's no such thing as work. Like, you know, it's an activity you do to sustain yourself, you know, whether it's grinding acorns or gathering tules or making yourself some new clothes, and or, you know, that sort of thing. So I think time for us is very different, and in that the way my ancestors spent their time was mostly interacting with their surroundings, with the others in their communities, to uh, sustain themselves. So their days consisted of processing acorns, fixing their homes, making their clothes, cooking the food, you know, the whole. I would say that they would spend on average half the day or a couple hours a day gathering, processing, and cooking different foods, because they weren't, they couldn't say, oh, I'm going to take the day off and get takeout or, right. So this is something I've thought about for years, how the ancestors spent or conducted themselves throughout the day. What were they doing, Well, they were making tools. They were doing all the stuff that we pay for now.
Yeah, they were in direct relationship with the material conditions of their lives, right? As opposed to the indirect way, make the money to buy the thing. Yeah, so they were, and it was all coming from a single landscape. Yeah, so that's so interesting to me, that idea that, and that would be held, it's both sacred and it's practical. It binds you to the land, it binds you to the materials of your own life. And so the meaning that's transmitted around that, it doesn't have that anonymity of like, oh, I'm going to look at the bottom of this tchotchke and see where it might have been made. And I can have this speculative notion of like what kind of circuitous route it traveled through, global supply chains to get to where I am. Mm-hmm. But, that, and things could be replaced and repaired all from the same landscape. There's just the directness of the connection is very interesting. And I would just say one thing to that is that when we think about, sometimes that might sound like very appealing. And we're like, okay, well, what would it require of us in order to have that? And and maybe we think about that in terms of increase, like what other skills would I need to gain in order to be able to do that? What tools would I need in order to be able to make these things? And there's this acquisitive sense still around that. But I think maybe a better question is like, what would I have to let go of in order to be more directly connected in that way? What would I have to forego the options of being able to buy whatever I wanted if it was your choice to spend the time to make the thing? It would in fact require that you be satisfied with less in some sense, but with less quantitatively, but with more in terms of the connection that's happening there, of binding you to people and to land. I think about like that is a relationship that needs, serious renegotiation. I saw some hands go up, but I lost them. Who had their hands up? Angela Gigi, and then Angela Miller.
I guess I not to put the pressure on Lazaro, but I am interested to hear something about, and not that there's one uniform thing, but some idea of indigenous ideas about, I guess what I'm trying to say is like, in my view, one of our great colonial problems is this basis of competition, and that stratifies like every layer of our culture and creates problems like work is suffering, and these are things that help create the divisions between people, in my view, and create our separation from working in concert with nature. And I'm not an educator per se, but like, for instance, my interest in helping the kids down at the school is other ways, and I know you are an educator, Lazaro, like removing them from those models of learning that are so much based on performance and their ranking and the right way to learn and not making mistakes and being under pressure of time and meeting standards. And I don't know, that's a lot of bundle, but I think it does speak almost to what you were just saying, Cameron, in terms of like our connection to each other and into how we're connecting to the work of existence, right? Anyway, I don't know.
Well, you know, there's a lot of layers to this. I think in competitions, there has to be a winner and a loser, and or losers, and to me, you know, it would involve changing the rules. You know, basically changing the protocols that we're supposed to follow or we follow, and if a lot of people do it, that becomes the rule. You know, that's what happens, right? So, you know, there's a sense of competition, especially in our society, like in a packed society or city like we live in. There's competition for housing, there's competition for jobs, there's competition for everything, right? But the reality is that everybody's different.
Mhm.
So how could you compete with somebody that's different from you? That doesn't make any sense to me, right?
Yeah.
So there's kind of a subtle, I guess, a nuanced criteria, you know, in that type of direction of thinking. There's I don't know if you've ever talked to the kids about how they're unique, you know, and to value people who are different, right? Because if we were all the same, then what sense does that make, right? If we were just all the same, right? It's no fun. So that's something to think about. But what if, another thing is, what if the competition was to live in harmony and to preserve our surroundings? What if that was the competition? What if the competition was to see who was more generous? You know, in our society and a lot of Native societies, it was, you know, gift giving was like a competition.
Mhm.
You know, gift giving was not just a ritual; it's a competition. You know, I mean, and it has to do with like, it has to do with solidifying the community, right? Solidifying the sense of community and trust. But I'm just saying, like, what if, you know, we took competition the way we practice it today and turned it on its head? So I don't know if that connected directly.
No, it does. It does. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Angela Miller and then Linda Gabriel. Thank you.
Well, I was thinking about what Cameron is talking about, relationship to time. And the image of George Floyd dying. You know, I'm 65, almost years old, and I thought we had made more progress than that. You know, every like the civil rights movement, and then when Obama got elected twice, I kept thinking, oh, you know, it's happening. We're finally there. And when I saw that, I realized the virulence and the oppression is so real and so alive, even now, that I almost despaired. I mean, entirely. But I was reading in the Talmud, and I saw this quote from Rabbi Tarfon: "Do not be arrogant. Do not think that you alone can finish the job. Trust in your children and generations yet unborn to take up the task." And I thought about my magnificent sons. And so my relationship to time at that point changed. And I realized that I was only passing the baton, that I was not going to accomplish in my generation what I had hoped to. But it doesn't mean it won't be accomplished.
Thank you for sharing that. Thank you. Linda Gabriel.
My internet connection has been weird, so I hope you can hear me. And following what Angela says, I wanted to make a comment about, this feels like a small thing to say because I'm very moved by what you just said, Angela. But I didn't want to leave the discussion about competition without mentioning that I'm very interested in the etymology of words, and I like to look at the original meanings. And the word compete means simply to walk together. So I think that fits in with what Lazaro was saying about, you know, redefining it or maybe returning to its original meaning. And I think about the spirit that you had as kids, like who can run fastest and reach the tree? You know, it's a spirited, fun thing, and it isn't really about winners and losers. It's just, it doesn't have to be putting someone down. And John mentioned something about, you know, where do we go from here? And I've been thinking about a couple of themes that have come up in the conversation. There's ownership, the urge to dominate, and then Cameron, you brushed on like the desire to acquire things. And I think one place to begin is in our own hearts and to see where we have unconsciously followed those patterns. The same way that we're taught wonderful things, we also learn these really bad habits. And so maybe just becoming a little more conscious about how it is you interact with people, with gardens, with just the way you move through the world. Where are we dominating? Where are we wanting to grasp onto things in a way that's inappropriate and out of harmony? That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
I wanted to sort of I want to toss a vision, an image into the cauldron here and see if we can work with that a little bit. So it's something that Sepulveda says. As we were coming into this conversation, I was formulating some questions and prompts around it. And one thing that came up was this idea of like, and also thinking about settler colonial thinking as being embodying ideas of the Enlightenment, of rationality and logic, but then just looking at the kind of destruction that has wrought. So thinking about the question, why is logic insufficient? We can acknowledge, that everything is interconnected. That can be an intellectual acknowledgement that has no effect on our behavior, right? But if something's held as sacred, maybe we can start to enter into a relationship at that point that can help to actually affect like the kind of behavioral changes that lead to these intergenerational patterns of being on the land. So Sepulveda talks about the indigenous relationship to the land, and he says that their identities as indigenous are meaningfully related to the land and the river. This connection is analogous to an umbilical bond. What is put into her body is also ingested and fed on by us. So I just want to put it out as a prompt to maybe try to work with the image of like thinking about how our actions, like that there is a direct connection between what we put into the land, the decisions that we make, and what that feeds back into us, right? To try to envision the unbrokenness and to move it from an intellectual acknowledgement, this sort of fact-based thing, and into a relational conception of your body as an extension, your body as an unbroken chain between the boundary of your skin and where you meet the rest of the earth. So I just want to throw that out there as a little image in the cauldron to be worked with.
Cameron, I wanted to just comment first, before we move on, that it's acknowledged in our community that we have something called an indigenous logic. I mean, it's an actual thing that we're discussing now because we have it, right? It's just hasn't been labeled and produced and disseminated. But when you guys, talk about this word logic, I mean, we look it up, we know that the Greeks, right, which is where Western civilization gets its model. It's modeled after a lot of Greek things, right? Greek ideals and architecture. But people around the world have their different types of logic, So I just wanted to acknowledge that here as a group, if we could.
Yeah, for sure. I'm just referencing the one that's, I guess, associated with kind of a really formal mathematical style of logic that has been really at the center of informing, you know, a lot of cultural things and land management things. But yeah, big acknowledgement to other modes of, other epistemologies, other modes of knowing, and that those can be considered logic as well. Yeah, for sure. Jessica Perez.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment because as we're talking about all this, it kind of is bringing up a lot for me. I think that I kind of relate with what Greg is saying. I think the universe has been pushing me for a very long time down this road about experiencing nature in a different way and looking at it and from a different perspective. And I think that when you experience time in the way that Lazaro has taught us, in this beautiful way of just engaging with her, there's an opportunity to listen. And although you're listening in a different way, I feel that for me, I ended up forgetting about my very logic-driven brain because I'm a managing analyst. That's what I do by trade. So I'm always thinking. But it forced me to stop putting myself in the way and just allowing nature to speak to me. And as I did, I think that the attractive nature of water kind of brought all the individuals that needed to show up into my life. And it was because I just got out of my head. I just decided to participate in life and just go with the flow of the people that were around me, because they were coming and they were gathering in the ways that they needed to. And Lazaro, I think, came in such a wonderful time. The BirdHouse came into my life in such a wonderful time. And so I feel that now we are all kind of fundamentally experiencing a different flow of life, a different connection to it that I think we're all being called to. So much so that I think Robin, this beautiful person, walked into my life. Robin, I met him 3 times. And after the 3rd time, he asked, hey, do you want to walk? Because he lives next to the La Bayona Creek, and I live in the LA River, next to the LA River. And I do ritual, and I go and give her gifts, and I go and I talk to the LA River. And here he is on the other side with her sister, you know, talking to La Bayona, having this relationship with her. And just out of this connection that we're having with nature, it brought us together to the point that we walked 22 miles from the LA River to La Bayona to the beach. And it was just he and I and a few others that met us along the way. But I think that kind of speaks to what you're talking about, Cameron, is that I am now allowing myself to experience time in this way that is in reciprocity to a certain extent, but also just I feel that now I can see the abundance that this earth has to offer, and I want to give in the same way. I want to be of service in that way. So I think that negotiating these things that you're talking about, the way that we kind of logically think about our worlds, if we just kind of release and surrender to the flow, there is so much on the other side, even though we don't know, even though we don't have a path. So I think that this gathering is an indication of that. It's a symptom of that there is a way, because there is a will that we're all kind of bringing in different ways and manifesting in different ways. But yes, I feel that just thinking about who's here in this group, I'm just so thankful for each and every one of them. And in my development as a human, that I just have to say that I'm just grateful for this conversation and just the way that I'm experiencing time, and along with beautiful people like Lazaro, like Cameron, like John Bella, you know, Robin, all these beautiful people, Angela, everybody. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that, Jessica. That made me think about Lazaro's idea of starting a competition, of turning that on its head. Maybe you just set the bar pretty high there for how we need to express gratitude for each other and sharing space with each other. Yeah, so thank you for that. Yeah, so we're coming to the end of the time that we've allotted for this, and I wanted to just take a moment to talk about the idea of endings as we approach the end of this thing. And it's very connected to what we've been discussing with the idea of cycles. But the 3rd article that we referenced is It's called Rethinking the Apocalypse, an Anti-Futurist Manifesto. And it's centered from an Indigenous point of view. And it discusses the fact that for Indigenous people here in the Americas, and we could say for the land here, as we're acknowledging that it has its own memory as well, that it has experienced apocalypse already, and that it has survived this, and it is now in a new phase of its cycle. Like I started it off by saying that the Tongva are living people, and they have endured this apocalypse, that our ancestors who left where they came from, it's not likely that they were leaving a very pretty situation over there. So I think there's something in the air about endings and apocalypse right now. I think that with the COVID pandemic happening, it led people to think about, the apocalypse of individual lives that are lost, but of life ways that are being lost as well. And behind all of this is this looming specter of climate change, which feels often kind of like some kind of ultimate ending that we're anticipating, an ultimate apocalypse. And I just want to throw into the mix here the idea that there have been many apocalypses, and that people have survived them, and they have survived them by staying together and by staying connected to the land. And I just want to bring that sense of an ending as we approach the end of this conversation, that as though we have this heaven and hell dichotomy, that the ending of the world will happen in a single moment or something, this dark shining moment of ending. But in fact, it's just all these processes that are embedded within larger and larger cycles. And that I think that just given my own background, being raised in the Judeo-Christian tradition, the idea of endings and the sort of study of eschatology is very, very prominent there. And so the idea of endings always loomed large for me in a really existentially threatening way. But I think that there is something that I'm trying to shrug off about that conception of endings there, and the fact that they're important, that they're healthy, they're part of larger cycles. Anybody's welcome to speak to that if they wish, or anything else. If there's people who haven't spoken, I'd love to hear from you as well. Linda.
Just real quickly, because it's back to my hobby of looking up the original meanings of words, and apocalypse means revelation and disclosure and discovery and things being revealed, which I think speaks maybe to Angela's sadness about where we are, but I think in some ways what's underneath had to be revealed, and that's happening a lot. So we're in this kind of, maybe it's not so much an ending, Cameron, as a pause for people to reestablish themselves and reconnect in different ways. But anyway, apocalypse is the opposite of eclipse. So things are covered with an eclipse, and apocalypse is revealing things. Some of them not so fun to look at, but it's maybe more of a transition than an ending. That's just want to throw that in there. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, Deborah.
Hi. Thank you so much first for inviting me to this. It's been very inspiring. Really, really enjoying this conversation. One word that has been thrown out a couple times is mindset. And I feel like with everything going on right now, whether it's through COVID, Black Lives Matter, or this conversation that we're having at this moment, it's all about how to change someone's mindset, or maybe the word change isn't so much the right word, but starting to refocus and take a deep breath and slow down. To me, COVID, I keep finding the silver linings within it. And that is putting me in a completely different mindset. And this entire conversation, I think just the word mindset has really stood out to me. Because that's pretty much what a lot of this has been about, even through time. And it's been how people's mindsets have changed. And I'm not sure where else I'm going with this, but I think you guys get what I'm saying. Is just the word mindset is such a key here. It's just such a key word. And I hope that we could start seeing more positive mindsets rolling out of this and this conversation we're having, and just spread out to the entire world. So there goes my phone ringing, of course, when I'm off mute. So yeah, anyways, go ahead.
Yeah, John?
Speaking of endings, would you promote an ongoing conversation of this group for those who want to continue? Or do you want to leave it as a standalone? Now that everyone's here gathered, we could offer an invitation to crank it up again, not so far future.
Sure, yeah. I'm going to send a follow-up email that has some references to the materials we've talked about today, and in that, so that you don't have to answer with everybody watching, right? You can respond individually to me if you'd be interested in continuing the conversation, and we'll see what the responses are like and what the interest is.
I just want to share a little piece of good news here. It seems like it's in alignment with the conversation, but because it just posted about an hour ago, but I live in Northern California in Santa Rosa. So somewhere between us, around Big Sur, the Northern California Esalen tribe regains their ancestral land after 250 years. So there's 1,200 acres there around Big Sur, and it's beautiful, beautiful land, and it's been returned to the tribe that was there when the Spaniards arrived. Thanks.
Yeah, very pertinent.
It just happened. So it happened because we were talking.
Yeah, and there's an article, Greg actually posted a link to a news article in the chat if anybody wants to get a piece of info about that. Oh. Angela Miller, were you raising your hand there? You're on mute again.
You're so patient with me, son. Thank you. If you've been following the news, I think we finally have gotten the Cleveland Indians to relinquish Chief Wahoo and their name. And they are in conversation with the Lake Erie Indigenous people about coming up with a new one. So it's taken years. It's been a long fight, but it's something.
Yeah, right after the Washington football team.
Right.
Will be known as the Washington football team and not use that slur that's associated with their name.
Mm-hmm.
Which is great. Anybody else who hasn't spoken? Anybody care to chime in now? Yeah, Robin?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about, you were talking about the end, and it makes me think about the beginning. And I'm just remembering at the beginning of this conversation, talking about the different rivers, the Santa Ana and the Santa Clara River. And the Santa Clara, about 2 years ago in the wintertime, I walked from the foothills of the mountains along the Santa Clara River all the way down to Ventura where it hits the ocean. And when you guys were talking about it, I was remembering this. It took a few days, like I just can't. You muted me. Should I stop talking or?
Oh, no, that was not intentional. No, go ahead.
It was you, John. You watch it, mister. Anyway, okay, there's just this one memory I wanted to share with you guys. And I don't know exactly why I want to share it, but it's just been in my mind this whole meeting. So it was early one morning. I slept just like somewhere, I don't know, I just found somewhere to sleep. And then I was walking, it was still really cold and it was early. And it was this point where the river gets really small and bends. And right where it bends, there's like these tall fences it goes through, these like really tall fences. And it was like the sun wasn't even up yet. And I looked in and there were all of these tigers walking around the Santa Clara River. There was tons of tigers. And I felt scared that they would eat me, that they would jump over the fence and eat me. But I also felt very alive. And I don't know. I just keep thinking about that. I keep thinking about kind of the placement, like it just has been coming up, these creatures around us that require us to be humble and to be thankful for our lives. And I don't even know. I just wanted to share that story with you, that there's tigers in the Santa Clara River. And yeah, and thank you all for being here.
Cool, thank you, Robin. I'll have to look that up. Tigers in the Santa Clara River. Anything else from anybody?
Janet.
Janet, go ahead.
So I have really enjoyed being part of this conversation. And the thing that struck me in the very beginning, the idea of entombing the river and the connection to mass incarceration, that connection, I don't think I will ever think about the LA River in the same way again. Mm-hmm. So that right there is such a potent image of a mindset shift that I just want to leave it with that. That really meant a lot to me, moved me.
Excellent. Yeah, Sepulveda develops that parallel really strongly in the article, which I'll share with you afterward if you're interested. I highly recommend it to everybody. It really, just a lot of revelations came out of reading that, and I've read it a few times now. Right. Lazaro, would you like to say anything to close?
Yeah, I just want to say that when there's an ending in respect that we're talking about cycles, that also indicates a beginning of something else. Mm-hmm. That's how cycles work. One thing ends and another thing begins. Mm-hmm. Right? So that's just, I would say that reframing, right? Renegotiating and reframing what we already practice, and it's what came to mind when you were talking about that ending, which I think we're getting to now. And I'm just happy to have been able to participate. I'm proud and honored to have conversed with all of you about this, to listen to you. And I'm just really grateful. Thank you, Cameron. Thank everybody.
All right, so I'm just going to close with this little, this beautiful moment that Sepulveda writes in the article. And let's just think about this as a direction that we're trying to work toward together, trying to work collectively toward this visions. He says, however, I can envision the river restored, undomesticated through an abolition of the flood control methods that currently entomb and imprison the river in concrete, not allowing it to recharge the underground water. In an indigenous knowledge of the future, in other words, Acjachemen and Tongva theory, the river will be what it needs to be again, free from channelization and dams, free from pollution, without invasive species, and alive with native plants and animals, in a living spiritual relationship with the indigenous peoples of the land and their guests. Yeah. That's where we're moving toward. I'm glad to be moving toward that direction with all of you.
Thank you, everyone. I really enjoyed being with you all. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. So,
Thank you, everybody.
and I will follow up in the next couple of days, and hopefully we can keep this conversation going in some form or other.
Thank you all. This is lovely. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you, Lazaro.
We'll see you soon.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Lazaro.
Bye.
Thanks, Cameron.
Thanks, Robin.
Thank you, Cameron.
Thank you, Angela.
Thank you, Sam.
Thank you, Cameron.
Thank you, Cameron.
Thank you. It was good. We can do a little debrief, but I gotta go to the bathroom.
Bye, Angela.
Bye-bye. Nice to see you all.
Yes.
I
Bye,
can't figure out
Angela.
how to get off here. Oh, there it is.
I'm going to end the recording and say goodbye.
Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.